It goes without saying that Pokemon is a massive franchise. It all started in 1996 with Pokemon Red and Green versions in Japan, and much later in the year, the Pokemon trading card game we all know would debut. The Pokemon Adventures manga and the anime would follow in 1997, and then the anime and games would finally hit the West in September of 1998. It grew so fast in the mainstream, a lot of people that weren't into it were overwhelmed. Every block had some sort of Pokemon merchandise that existed. You just couldn't get away from Pokemon. With all this content, there would of course be more than just the main Pokemon game series. Even before Generation 2, we already had more than one spin-off game. Some of these were just a one-time thing, while others have infrequent sequels or no longer get any sequels at all. The question is, what exactly happened to some of these spin-offs, and how do some of them hold up in hindsight? Now, to be clear, there are a lot of these, and I won't be covering every single one of them, but I'll try to split my attention between some of the major spin-offs that people talk about. Before we start though, I have a new channel called Mystic Reads, where I read anime fanfics, so if that's up your alley, consider checking it out. Also, over on Mystic Umbreon Shorts, we're doing 5 facts about every single Pokemon every single day. So if you like Mystic Umbreon daily content, check out both those channels. Links will be in the iCard and the description below. And if we can hit 5,000 subscribers, I have a very special top 5 series I'm going to be doing over on Mystic Umbreon Shorts. So let's get there. So with that, let's get started. The first I'd like to discuss is Pokemon Stadium. The original Japanese version of the game was released 1 month before we even saw Red and Blue here in the West, and is the first 3D Pokemon game ever released, as well as the first spin-off in the series. This development plan for the game ended up having some issues, and only ended up having 42 Pokemon usable in the game. Ouch. The Pokemon Stadium we have here in the West is actually Pokemon Stadium 2. And our Pokemon Stadium 2 is called Pokemon Stadium Gold, Silver, and Crystal version in Japan. Confused? Well, don't sweat it too much. We'll just be talking about the Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2 we all know and love that we got over here. The first game had the huge novelty of having the traditional Pokemon battles in full 3D for the first time ever, with all 151 Pokemon having some unique animations and a lot of personality, selling over 3 million copies in North America alone. A lot of kids seeing ads for the game for the first time that didn't know about Pokemon Stadium at all kind of freaked out at the time. A real 3D Pokemon game? You can make Charizard and Tauros duke it out on my TV on the N64? It sounds silly now, but it was only early in the year 2000 when we got this game, and Pokemon was still in its initial explosion of popularity here. Most people had a lot of fun with it, but it definitely had some clear repetition without the other RPG elements from the core games. There's no adventure or real plot in Pokemon Stadium. It's just battle after battle after battle, fighting to win the various tournaments and leagues. You could even use the N64 transfer pack to use your actual Pokemon from the Gen 1 core games in battle with their movesets and stacks intact. And of course you can do this with your Gen 2 Pokemon in the second game. There's also some ridiculous mini-games included in both entries, and some fans even remember these mini-games more than the actual battling aspect. So, does it hold up? I think both this and its sequel hold up fine if you know what you're getting into. They have a bit more staying power as features go than Battle Revolution, though Battle Revolution had the privilege of existing in a generation where you could play online with others. I think that also answers the question of what happened to the Stadium series in a way. The concept evolved into games like Revolution. These types of Pokemon games aren't as appealing in content as they used to be though, and including 9 generations worth of Pokemon would be quite the development investment that they probably wouldn't deem worth over other projects in the current era. And as far as stimulating battles go, tons of fans use Pokemon Showdown. However, both Stadium games are coming to the Nintendo Switches online in 2023, meaning you'll be able to officially play against your friends online with them, and I assume you'll also be able to play those mini-games online too. It's great to see these Nintendo 64 classics preserved with the modern multiplayer functionality. There's also Pokemon Colosseum and Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, which came out on the GameCube between Stadium 2 and Revolution. But this one wasn't exactly a battle simulation, but still followed the straightforward battling style as the Stadium games. Both games are pretty liked within the fandom for what they are. But to ask what happened to Colosseum and XD maybe feels a little strange, as these were actually closer to traditional Pokemon games with their own narrative. And at any moment, we can get a spin-off in that vein, even if they aren't the direct sequels to the games. Legends Arceus, while not really considered a spin-off, is kind of an example of this. A game in the franchise that isn't exactly a part of the main series in a traditional way, but still has a lot of the familiar battle system with some pretty major twists. If anything, these types of spin-offs may be the new in thing for Game Freak to develop alongside the core games, considering how beloved Legends Arceus is. I do, however, still think it would be cool to one day see a Pokemon game with a similar vibe as these GameCube classics, even if it's not actually a direct sequel, while also being a bit experimental with the formula. Now I'd like to talk about a different Pokemon game that made its way to the Nintendo 64. Pokémon Snap. The context of this entry for us in the West is once again a bit different for those in Japan. Because the timeline of Pokemon releases was so different for us early on, Pokémon Snap was the first 3D Pokemon game we ever got to see here, not Pokémon Stadium. For us over here, Stadium was just the first 3D Pokemon game with the typical battles we all know and love. So for many of us, Pokémon Snap did have quite the novelty as well. Like Stadium, the game holds up well if you know what type of game you're getting into. But it wasn't quite what Westerners wanted out of their first 3D Pokemon experience at the time. It's the sort of game that's appreciated more in concept now than back then. I'd ask what happened to the game as a potential series, but a sequel was suddenly released over 20 years later for the Nintendo Switch. The original is also now on the Nintendo Switch online library. Let's close off this discussion of N64 spin-offs with Hey You Pikachu. Unlike Stadium and Snap, this game that featured voice-based commands was pretty infamous. Personally, I think there's a certain art to the game that one can appreciate, but some of the gameplay design is pretty frustrating, and a lot of kids gave up on it back in the day without making it far. Even when the game recognizes your voice perfectly, sometimes Pikachu just does what it wants to do and will eat up time. Actually, the more I think about certain parts of the game, the funnier I find it. It kind of reminds me of Pikachu in the first episode of the anime, but less mean. It's like Pikachu is trolling the player by just doing what it wants when the player wants to go after a certain goal. It's definitely a game that is more aimed at younger kids, but it may also really test that kid's patience. A lot of them are going to go back to Pokemon Stadium or Red and Blue. But when you're in the mood for it, there's definitely something kind of mellow and relaxing about the game. A lot of the time, you're just kind of watching stuff happen. And speaking of just watching stuff happening, well, Hey You Pikachu kinda sorta got a sequel. Pokemon Channel is often labeled as a sequel of sorts, even having the same developer, Umbrella. Much of Pokemon Channel is just watching stuff, and when you're not just watching stuff like Pichu Bros or something, you're participating in quizzes and the like. It's another game definitely tailored for younger kids, but this one is a little more harmless, despite having even less gameplay than its predecessor. As soon as you start it up, you'll realize that Pokemon Channel isn't trying to hide what it is. But because I played Pokemon Channel personally as a kid a lot, I will say that it is a game that majorly touched my heart. I remember going to Cobalt Coast and fishing with Pikachu picking up sticks in Viridian Forest, then there was the Constellations. Pokemon Channel has a lot of really unique stuff that a lot of people seem to forget about. Not to mention that you can also interact with Jirachi. Pokemon Channel is a game that I personally really love. But of course, you know, not all people are going to feel the same exact way as I do about it. Umbrella would go on to create other spin-offs, like Pokemon Dash and the Pokemon Rumble series. These games never really made much of a splash though, and always had pretty mixed reception at best. Umbrella would eventually get absorbed into the Creatures Development Studio, and we wouldn't see any more of these games after that. Since we're moving a bit ahead in the timeline, let's talk about a far more modern spin-off, Pokken. This game had a pretty decent amount of hype during the wait for its release. A big budget Pokemon fighting game? It was like a dream come true. Then it came to the arcades and yeah, people thought it was pretty cool. Fans were excited to get to the home console version. And then it came to the Wii U, and people liked it. But it never made quite the explosion you would imagine when you think Pokemon fighting game. There are a few reasons for this. For one, the roster was kinda small, especially considering how many creatures the series has. The final fighter count is only 23. Another issue was the fact that the game was only on the zombie that was the Wii U. Look, the system had some really fun games developed for it, but the console had no excitement around it whatsoever, and that really hurt games like Pokken. The game still had a decent amount of content, but nothing crazy. It still has an active competitive community as well, and I think that community would be bigger if the game had more focused promotion before its release. But sadly, it was still going to be on the Wii U. It did get ported to the Switch, but it still wasn't promoted that well. Maybe it was already too late to make the big splash the game needed. I'm probably making it sound worse than it actually is, but it's a shame because the game is pretty good and got a generally positive response when it first came out. As far as what will happen to this type of game in the future, Katsuhiro Harada, one of the game's producers, is open to the idea of a sequel, but made it clear that it's up to IP owners to decide if they ever want it to happen. What about Pokemon Mystery Dungeon? I noticed that these games have a fairly devoted and passionate fanbase, myself included. The storytelling, narrative style, and pacing of the game are quite different from something like the main core series, and I would even argue that it has a better plot than some of the main series Pokemon games. But it's tough to say what could happen with Mystery Dungeon. Some fans felt that Super Mystery Dungeon was going to be the last in the series, and then they didn't actually make any new games after that after all. They did do remakes of the first games in 2020, leading some to suspect that they'll eventually remake Explorers of Time and Darkness. But those are remakes, which is great for those fans. But it's hard to say if they'll ever end up making an entirely new Mystery Dungeon game or not. It's an interesting part of the franchise in that it's one of the first games you think of when it comes to Pokemon spin-offs, but it's definitely not one that every fan has played. I think the sentiment about Pokemon Ranger is pretty similar, minus the remake aspect. It's actually been 12 years since the last game was released, which is a shame for fans of that series. I have no idea what happened to this series exactly. It does seem like right around this time period in the late 2000s and 2010s is when a lot of these spin-off series started to just end. Ranger never seemed as popular as Mystery Dungeon, despite Shadows of Almia being pretty liked by fans, so it's hard to say if it will ever get the same treatment. Pokemon Pinball is one of the last two spin-off series I'd like to talk about. If you've never played these, then you're probably thinking, Mystic, it's Pinball. Go talk about Detective Pikachu or something. Well, as far as the first Pinball game goes, yeah, fine. It's basically just Pinball with a Pokemon catching twist. It's actually quite basic, but still a very competent pinball game. But I think Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire stick out a lot more. There were more than just two boards for you to play on, and they were able to flesh out the personality of the series more this time around. It's hard to say why exactly they never made another sequel though. I think at least one more Pokemon Pinball would have been great. They could have had a lot more fun creating boards with the Nintendo DS's dual screen, but we can only imagine what it could have been like. The last spin-off I want to talk about is one that I find to be incredibly underrated. The Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy Color. Just the fact that you could effectively play the TCG on your Game Boy was already cool back then, but there's so much love put into the game. While it doesn't have too much of a story other than your player character wanting to defeat the Club Masters and the Grandmasters around the game's map, the game still manages to have its own feel while respecting the fact that it's still technically a Pokemon game, and does a great job of teaching you the basics of the card game. They also recreated the actual card art for the in-game battles, which is just crazy. They're all so interesting to look at and make collecting and using different cards a little more fun, just like the actual card game. The music is also really memorable and catchy. The normal battle music in particular is genuinely one of the best regular battle themes in the entire franchise. The game doesn't seem that long at first, but even some of the normal battles can take a while to finish depending on your luck or just how things play out. The only major issue outside of not having an interesting story or world is the tutorial at the start. There's nothing wrong with it, but boy is it wordy. It's actually very good at teaching you how to play the game. And there's even a tutorial match, but you definitely need to be patient and pay attention as you get started with the game so that you know what you're doing. It functions as a fantastic getaway into the world of the trading card game. But a lot of people playing Pokemon games are kids, especially back then. And kids only have so much patience to sit through exposition, so it was definitely a turnoff for some people. I don't talk about the TCG much on this channel, but if you're not familiar with it, I think this game is a really good way to get started. Just keep in mind that this game is over 20 years old, so it won't exactly get you caught up on the current meta. By the way, for some reason, this game has a rival? In Japan, the game was released in 1998. So is Ronald from the Game Boy Color TCG technically the second rival ever in the franchise? I find it humorous that they even bothered with this, as the rival character wasn't even technically a trope yet in the series. There is a sequel to this game literally called Pokemon Card GB2, Here Comes Team GR, but it was only released in Japan. But from what I know, it's more of the same concept with a few new twists that you would expect from a sequel. As for why this series was never continued after this, it's hard to say once again. With the franchise as big as Pokemon, these types of game concepts are inevitably going to come and go. Of course, there is the Pokemon trading card game online, as well as its soon-to-be replacement, the Pokemon trading card game Live. But those two really are more so medians to just playing the card game as is. More like applications than games really. As good as I think the original TCG was for the Game Boy Color, I'm not entirely sure what else they can do to warrant a new game in the modern era that isn't more of the same idea, or what kind of budget such a game would warrant. The first game was released in the West in April of 2000, and some critics did note that the game's quality was evidence that Pokemon wasn't just a fad, and that it was likely to be around for a long time if they were going to keep releasing products like this. Well, it's been 22 years since then. And while some spin-offs have come and gone, the Pokemon franchise as a whole is still around and as popular as ever, and we're sure to see even more interesting spin-offs in the coming years. But what do you guys think? Any of these games you'd like to see me talk about in more detail in the future? Any games you have fond memories with that I didn't mention? What personal stories do you have with these games? Which spin-off games do you think can be brought back in some way? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I personally would like a sequel to Pokemon Channel, or Pokemon Coliseum, but that'll wait for another day. Hey, it's the outro. Isn't that exciting? Thank you for enjoying another Mystic Umbreon video. We're getting ready to enter the fall, and the final stretch of hype for Scarlet and Violet is here. The excitement for Pokemon's 9th generation is at its peak, and I couldn't be more excited. We've still got plenty to cover before then though, so keep yourselves locked in. If you're interested in more Mystic content, check out my TikTok and Mystic Umbreon Shorts channel. If we get the 10k followers on TikTok, and we're super close, I'll be doing a viewer's choice video. Also, if you're into fanfictions and what ifs, check out Mystic Reads. I offer a ton of creative spoken word content on there, so come and join me. That's all for now. Make sure you subscribe for more fantastic content, and I'll see you next time.